Welcome to Just Energy Radio with your host, naturopath and medical intuitive, Dr. Rita Louise. We have learned from Einstein's theory that matter and energy are one. Physicists believe that all systems in nature have their own particular way of vibrating. From the swinging of a pendulum to the waves of the ocean to the light that brightens the sky each day, each of these oscillates at its own unique rate. The same holds true for every thought, feeling, event, or word we speak. Each has its own frequency or rate of vibration. What many of us don't realize is when we take everything in our universe down to its simplest form, it is all just energy. Join Dr. Rita Louise on a journey through time and space where past, present, and future collide. Today, what you believe may be called into question. What we want to know is, who made up the rules? Be brave and step outside the box. We are about to turn our world upside down and venture into the unknown. Hold on. We are departing our own beliefs and entering alternative realms. Enjoy the possibilities.
Hello and welcome to Just Energy Radio. I'm your host, Dr. Rita Louise, and thank you all for tuning into the show today. We have a great show lined up. In the first hour, we're going to be speaking to Nicholas Brink about the power of Norse shamanism. And in the second hour, with MJ Ryan about how to survive change you didn't ask for. Don't forget, Just Energy Radio is brought to you by soulhealer.com. That you can find out about all the services I offer, including medical intuition evaluations, clairvoyant readings, and energy healing. So if you have stuff going on in your life, whether it's about your health, your relationship, about work, give me a call. We can set up a time for a private consultation by phone, in person, or even via Skype. It's also brought to you by the Institute of Applied Energetics. That's www.appliedenergeticsinstitute.com, where you can find out or you can download our 50-page free Jumpstart Your Intuition Guide, where you can actually start to access or explore and uncover your intuitive nature. That's all free at www.appliedenergeticsinstitute.com. So if you listened to the show last week, I had no internet access, and it was a great show, but it was pretty challenging. But we are back up and running, and so I'm just looking forward to being here with all of you from my new little penthouse location. It's all very exciting times. You know, we're going to be talking about surviving change, and I guess I asked for this one, and it makes it very exciting. So let me introduce you to our first guest, and let's get him on the air and talk about the power of Norse shamanism. Nicholas E. Brink, PhD, is a psychologist who has maintained a private clinical practice since 1977. He is also the author of the 2002 book, Grendel and His Mother, Healing the Traumas of Childhood Through Dreams, Imagery, and Hypnosis. He is also the author of another book that we spoke about on the show last time, and I don't have that in my hand, about ecstatic trance. He is also a certified teacher of ecstatic trance of the Felicitas Goldman Institute, and he lives in Coburn, Pennsylvania. So please welcome to Just Energy Radio the book author of the new book, Baldric's Magic, The Power of Norse Shamanism and Ecstatic Trance, Nicholas Brink. Hi, Nicholas. How are you?
Hi. Good. Thank you for the introduction.
I am just so glad to have you back on the show. I really enjoyed our time together last time. And when I saw you had this new book come out, I thought it was a wonderful opportunity to have you come back on.
Well, thank you. I'm glad to be back.
Well, good. So let's start here. In your last book, you explored the concept of ecstatic trance. And in this one, you focus on the Norse tradition. Why focus on a specific tradition?
This is a little different. I mean, the first book, I talked about healing and spiritual growth and accessing the universal mind. In this book, it's basically accessing the universal mind. I used ecstatic trance, and maybe I should explain ecstatic trance in a minute or two. But I used this book. I used ecstatic trance to go back and commune or visit or talk with my ancient ancestors. And so it was a very specific use of ecstatic trance for going back in time to my ancestors in Scandinavia.
Okay. Oh, so there was kind of a family history tie to the whole thing.
Right.
Well, how exciting. Do you have any idea if the concept of ecstatic trance? Well, actually, for the people that have not are not familiar with ecstatic trance, could you explain what the general idea of that is?
Right, and I figured that's where I should start.
Mm-hmm.
Back in 2007, I read the book by Felicitas Goodman, Where the Spirits Ride the Wind. And then a couple years later, at a conference at the International Association for the Study of Dreams, I went ahead and used what she had described in that book, and I was really amazed. What Felicitas Goodman did is when she got her doctorate in anthropology, she wanted to study ecstatic trance. And she did it by going to the examining what brought about the trance of speaking in tongues in the apostolic churches in Mexico. And in studying those churches, what she came up with is 4 basic requirements to go into trance. One was a belief that the experience was going to be pleasant and healthy and useful. Another part of the another factor was you have to be define or be in a sacred space. The third part was a meditation technique of quieting one's mind. In other words, in the church, it was through prayer. And the fourth was the rhythmic stimulation of the nervous system. In the church, it was clapping of hands. But you know that rhythmic stimulation is very common or very typical for the different primitive cultures, the shamanic cultures around the world. And so she took these 4 beliefs back to her students at Denison University, and she created a ritual that took it separate from the church. Basically, her ritual was one of first, describing the nature of trance. Then she defined the sacred space by 2 different tasks. One was the students were smudged with herbal smoke, the whole process of smudging, and then she called the spirits of each of the directions, and she developed a ritual around calling those spirits. Third, she then gave the students 5 minutes to quiet their minds and just focusing on their breathing before she started stimulating the nervous system by either beating a drum or the shaking of a rattle at 210, approximately 210 beats a minute. And in this stimulation, she would do this for 15 minutes, and then record or try to find out what the students' experiences were. But she felt something was missing. Somehow the experiences weren't very well organized. And then she read an article by a Canadian psychologist that was examining the effect of body posture on trance or on different meditation or trance experiences, and found that different body postures cause different physiological changes within the body. So in terms of breathing rate or heart rate or bowel motility, she found that there was a difference. And so a light went on inside of her, and she went back and looked at ancient and contemporary primitive art and found what she believed were postures used by shamans in these different cultures. And she collected about 50 or so of these postures. When she had her students sit, lay, or stand in these postures while going into trance, she then discovered how the posture produced a very specific experience, a trance experience. Some postures were for going within the body, for bringing in energy for healing. Other postures were for either journeying into the underworld, and some were for journeying in the middle world, and some were for journeying in the upper world. Then there were those postures that caused a death rebirth experience or initiation experience. Some postures were also for divination or finding answers to questions, while other postures were for shape-shifting or becoming, or metamorphosis, as you would call it, to become something else. And when I first used these postures at this dream conference, I was just really amazed at how accurate what she had to say was. And so I came home, and I have been doing this ever since. And I have a group at home, and I do it with other groups around the country. And I probably have collected now well over 2,000 of these experiences, which have been the content for my books. The first book was geared towards healing and spiritual growth, while this book was geared towards accessing the universal mind, or in other words, in this case, going back and communing with my ancestors. The thing is I can't necessarily prove that these are my ancestors, but I had it'll be interesting to tell you the experiences I've had that suggest that this is possible.
Mm-hmm. Well, and it sounds like, I can't speak to the postures. I mean, that's definitely your thing, but
right.
It sounds similar to the things that you do see in many indigenous cultures, where there is the beating of the drum or the rhythmic dancing or,
right.
The chanting to bring them into that ecstatic state. And so,
exactly.
Having a series of postures shouldn't be, it doesn't seem outside the box all that much.
When you look at the postures, when you see what the postures are, and you ask, what is that posture trying to express, they really make a lot of sense. For example, for divination, for asking a question and finding an answer, each of the postures are very similar to Rodin's The Thinker. You're sitting sometimes cross-legged, sometimes with your knees raised or on a chair, and often your left arm is up in front of your face. With Rodin, the chin is resting against the hand, but in these postures, the hand is usually away from the face, which leaves the area around the face more open, in my mind, to receiving an experience. The underworld postures, each of them are lying down close to the earth. One of the initiation or death rebirth postures, one of my favorites is the feathered serpent posture, where you're standing with your hands on your hips. And what does that posture express? It expresses a sense of determination, or a sense of I am ready to. Usually, when a person has an aspect of themselves that needs to die, and something else reborn, at first they may really be afraid and resist it. But once they reach the point of being determined to change, then that posture very much expresses that attitude of, I am ready. So I think in each case, if you look at the postures, you could and ask, what is the posture trying to express? They each make a lot of sense.
No, and I agree. And now I'm like flipping the book open, because there was one that jumped out at me personally. But, now that I'm sitting here with the book, and of course I didn't mark the page, I'll never find it. Because here it is. The Tandem lower world posture.
The lower world posture.
Yeah. And it's, I'm not 100% sure what it's for, but I know that when I'm trying to fall asleep, or I'm really restless, trying to fall asleep, I will take a posture like that, and just lay there
right.
and pay attention to my breathing, and it's just a very natural thing that I do. And I feel like some of these other postures that you look at in here are very natural things that people will do, like you were talking about putting your hands on your hips when you're trying to maintain or regain strength.
Right. The picture on the cover of the book is actually an image of fire, one of the Nordic fertility gods, and it's a posture that I sort of uncovered. Basically, his left hand is stroking his chin or stroking his beard, and the right hand is resting on his right knee. But again, that one's sort of, in some ways, it may not be that real clear on the picture there, but it's somewhat similar to Rodin's The Thinker in terms of the posture.
Well, and I think... Go ahead.
Oh, what I was going to say is, but what I when I was using these postures, again, like I said in the first book, there was mainly for healing, and in our interview before, I gave a lot of to me, they were fascinating experiences of how the healing experiences people had in using these postures. In this case, my very first indication that I was going back in time. I should read you this one. Actually, you have the book there. It's on page 56. I had used it for several years, and then I had this particular experience using the Halstead Warrior. The Halstead Warrior posture is a realm of the dead posture, where you're standing with your left hand sort of wrapped across your chest and your right hand across your abdomen, sort of like you're hugging yourself. And I think if I was going into the realm of the dead, I probably would be somewhat apprehensive. I would probably be protecting or hugging myself in that way. But when I had this experience back in 2010, that was about 3 years after I started using this, I went back to about 5000 BC in Germany at the time that was the date of that particular posture. And I found myself, okay, I'll read it to you. I was in a thatched hall, long and narrow, that sat near the entrance of a cave. A man wearing a bearskin was with me, not the leader, but the second or third in command. He told me that the group of men in the hall was preparing to go out for a hunt in the morning. Some of the men were drawing in the dirt pictures of animals and drawing spears stuck in them. Others were sharpening the ends of their spears. He then told me that since I was from the future, I must have some wisdom or knowledge that would help in the hunt. I shook my head no, but he was insistent that I was to lead them on the morning's hunt. We slept on the dirt floor around the fire, and in the morning I took the group in what felt to me like a random direction, though we did come to several deer. I motioned for the men, about a dozen of them, to spread out, and we herded the deer over a cliff. They all seemed overjoyed in appreciation, though I still felt that I had done nothing of significance or had no special knowledge. But this particular man that I was talking to, that was second or third in command, I had a real sense that somehow he was an ancestor. I felt a special connection with him. Since then, I've looked at these experiences, and I just got back from Ireland about a week ago, and I used these trance experiences at various burial mounds and cairns and different archaeological places around the country. And I found I wasn't really aware of any of my ancestry going back to Ireland. And each of these experiences, I was an observer. In that experience, I was part of the experience. And the rest of the experiences in the book, I really feel like I become part of them rather than just being an observer. That's one little difference. Then something else happened that gave me a sense of, wow, this is a real possibility. I was back in 2004, I was in Denmark, and I invited myself to go to the midsummer solstice celebration of Forsyth. What Forsyth is is to become a church in Denmark or Sweden, you have to petition the state church, which is the Lutheran church, to form this church. And foreign science petitioned the church and formed an official church. And they are the worshippers of the old gods, of Thor and Odin, and of these gods that I somehow have identified with. And in this Midsummer Solstice celebration, there's about 40 of us. We stood in a circle on the top of a burial mound on the island of Foon. And in this celebration, a horn of mead was passed around the circle 4 times. And each time around, we would take a drink of the mead from the horn, but each time around there was a specific task that was performed. And as I was writing this book, I was trying to remember what those 4 tasks were, and my mind was blank. I remembered the 4th time around, or the 3rd time around, each person expressed a concern, a personal concern about themselves or about somebody else in the group. So almost like a psychotherapy type of thing. And the 4th time around the circle, each person chose one of the Nordic gods that was important to them, and they go Heil Odin or Heil Freya, whatever god they were concerned about, and then give a little talk about why that god was important to them. But I could not recall the first 2. So I used ecstatic trance, and I went back to that experience back in 2004. And real quickly, it became very clear to me. The first time around the circle, each person gave thanks about something of nature, the weather, or whatever it might be. The second circuit around the circle, each person took some object they had, and they would put it in the center of the circle, and the priest and priestess, one would hold this ring above it, and the other would pour some mead through the ring onto the object to bless the object. And what became so clear to me is the man standing next to me, he put his Mjolnir, his Thor's hammer, in the center, and after it was blessed, he put it back on, but I saw him put it back on backwards. What usually is facing out is facing his chest. And it really sort of shocked me that I saw this. And so I happened to have his email address. I emailed him and told him what my experience was. And he got back to me immediately. He says he always puts it on backwards because he has a secret inscription on that one side that he wants to have against his chest. And it just sort of really blew our minds that I saw that so vividly in going back in time to that experience. And I think that one little incident really gave me a lot more confidence in the belief that I'm able to actually go back in time and experience things from the past, even though that was still during my lifetime. And in this book, I go back to previous distant ancestors. So that's those are a couple of things that how this began.
But it sounds almost like what you're doing, at least with going back to earlier times, is similar to like a past life regression sort of.
Exactly.
That would be, something that a hypnotherapist would use.
And as a psychologist and using hypnosis, I would occasionally have somebody go to a past life, though at the time I didn't necessarily. I was often curious, and I sometimes wanted to research to see if that past life was possible, but I never had a client that wanted to put that much energy into it. But I did assume that the experience was very important to them and probably reflected something out of their unconscious mind. But yeah, you're right. In this case, it felt like my ancestors. I've had at least one client or one person in my group that felt like they went back to past lives. That's something a little different than ancestors. My own ancestors.
I mean, does but in the trance that's produced, is it a similar kind of experience, or is it a different experience than a hypnotic type trance?
Yes and no. It's similar. I mean, you're in a different state of in a different altered state, and you experience things sort of metaphorically or dreamlike. But there is one difference that's been researched. In hypnosis, we begin by following one's breath and relaxing. It's a relaxation response. While in ecstatic trance, it's induced by this rapid beating of a drum. It's a sort of an excited state of a trance. And one researcher has noticed that in ecstatic trance, your sympathetic and your parasympathetic nervous systems usually, when you have the startled response, when you have an anxious response, that's the sympathetic nervous system functioning, and when you have a relaxation response, that's the parasympathetic nervous system. But in ecstatic trance, sometimes both systems are working together. Your heart rate is your blood pressure may drop, but your heart rate speeds up, which one researcher has pointed out that is a very common experience in a person who's near death. And that was sort of suggested that so often in shamanic journeying, they refer to that as near-death experiences. And so, I mean, there's some empirical evidence now that suggests that when you do go into a shamanic trance, that it is like a near-death experience. So there is some subtle differences, even though in general, in my mind, the metaphoric nature of what you experience is very similar. They're pretty much the same kind of experience.
So we have a question from the chat room, and it's Bill from New York, and it was really fitting in line with where we're at, so I'm going to go ahead and take it. And his question is, who is control of the trance, and how are you taken out of it? I mean, and I'm just going to add in a little piece, because you said that part of it is induced by the beating of a drum, but if you're doing the position, then how can you do the drum at the same time? So, do you know what I mean?
So, how do you go into trance, and how do you come out of it?
Who is in control of the trance?
Excuse me, say it again?
Who is in control? So when you do this...
who is in control?
Right.
Okay. Oh, that's another one of my favorite. I actually gave a paper at the Stream Conference this last week, and that was the main point of the paper. In hypnosis, there's a lot of interchange, there's a lot of back and forth talking with the client, and we come up with strategies together, and then as we go into trance, I'm providing hypnotic suggestions. In ecstatic trance, I don't do that talking. In estatic trance, I will just have the person stand or lay or sit in the posture, and then start drumming, and we see what happens. That I don't have all that input, but yet the posture does define the direction of the experience. And I've often thought that if I used these postures, and I have occasionally used a posture in my private practice, though I wouldn't do the smudging and the calling the spirits. I think most of the people that come to see a psychologist, that would not be expected. But I may have them, if we're using hypnosis, lie, sit, or stand in a particular posture, and I find that to me it's equally effective. In hypnosis, if I want a person to go into their unconscious mind, in ecstatic trance, I would have them laying down. If I wanted them to search for an answer to some question, I probably would have them sit there with their hand on their chin. So I find the postures can be very useful, but then the posture defines the nature of trance. How you come out of it is you go into it. We usually do it for 15 minutes, and you go into it with drumming, and when the drumming stops, you come out of it. I mean, there's enough of a, when the drumming stops, there's enough of a, I'd say, a jar to your, that physical stimulation to the body when it ends, that you naturally come out of trance. So I think there are those, it's different, but it's similar.
So if you are doing this work by yourself, can you drum for yourself, or do you have to use some kind of like a recording?
Right. No, I've always done this in a group setting, to where, and again, if a person has a problem, I don't necessarily have to know what their problem is. If they use a divination response, I might say, well, define to yourself what your problem is, and it happens with the divination posture. But, I lost my train of thought here. What was your question?
If you're doing it by yourself, do you drum for yourself, or do you use some kind of a recording?
Yeah. When I'm doing it in the group, and I'm doing the drumming or the rattle shaking, I have the same experience. I mean, the posture is in my mind, even though I cannot, if I'm doing the drumming, I cannot keep that posture. And at home, I've done it both ways. When I've done it by myself, I often use a CD recording of the drumming. But at times, if I feel like it, I will do the drumming myself and just have in my mind what posture I'm taking, even though I'm not in that posture. So in my mind, it can be done either way. But I often do use a CD with the drumming on that.
Yeah, I just finished an article that is sitting on my desk at my other house, waiting for me to get to it, talking about ancient healing techniques, ancient paradigms, and comparing them to the modern medical world. But anyway, I mean, regardless, one of the things that I mentioned very briefly is that drumming and rattles and instruments of percussion, one are found all over the world, but they're probably one of the most ancient musical instruments that were used, for healing. And it just makes me wonder if, in addition to, using them, with an ill person or a person who is trying to connect with their guidance, if, I just, for example, I'm thinking like of a Native American tradition, and they're sitting in the longhouse, or, I'm trying to think of the word for the round ones, but anyway, and they have the ceremonial pipe going around, and then they start drumming. If they all, or if some of them go into some kind of posture, I mean, we're not privy to that kind of stuff, but it would be interesting to find out.
Right. That's one question I have sometimes is, so often the whole tribe or the whole group of people are doing the dancing and the drumming, but it's often specific for their shaman. Usually there's only sort of one healer in the tribe, and that's their shaman. To me, I'm not a shaman. I teach people how to use these shamanic postures. I see myself more as a teacher. I would never call myself a shaman. And so I think that each of us could have these ecstatic trance experiences, and they're very powerful and very useful. I believe in basically in self-healing in that sense, rather than me being the shaman who performs sort of the magic to heal in the tribe. One thing, another dimension to this new book. First, in terms of my own personal ancestry, I have an adopted daughter who's now 47, who is Native American, and when she was young, I read her all these Native American stories that I felt were very important, and I really loved them and really learned to appreciate them, even though in her own life she could probably care less about her heritage right now. But then from that, I had a period of time when I was doing Tai Chi, and during that time I was reading the Oriental myths. But then somewhere along the line I decided I need to get into my own myths, my own heritage. And I read a lot of Celtic mythology and then this Nordic mythology. But from my genealogy, all the evidence I have is I'm German, English, and Dutch. The name Brink is Dutch. And I have quite a bit of genealogical information. The closest I have to Scandinavia is my mother's father. His name was Willoughby. My mother's maiden name was Willoughby, and Willoughby was supposed to have been a Norman name. And the Normans in northern France were originally Norwegian and Dutch or Danish. And so I somehow feel like I have connections that way. But somehow reading the Nordic mythology really resonated within me. It really made a lot of sense. You mentioned my first book of Grendel and his mother. That really, to me, the whole story of Beowulf really reflected very closely the whole process of psychotherapy. And from then on, I've always found so much depth to the Nordic mythology that I somehow thought I must be Nordic. And then a couple of years ago, I went to the National Geographic genome study where they took a swab from my cheek, and then they examined the genomes of that back to the original Eve, back into early Africa, and then they were able to trace it up to about 50,000 years ago. One thing I learned from that whole study was I have a gene that over 50% of the Sami reindeer herders in Finland have. And so that really, again, gave me some validation that there's a Nordic part of me, since the Samis have that too. Mm-hmm. But another dimension to this book that I've said the book is three-dimensional. One dimension is my own genealogy and my own background. To me, when I got into it, another important dimension is the belief that there was an earlier, during the hunters and gatherers time. If you look at the Near East, the Fertile Crescent and what is now Iraq between the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers, that's sort of where modern culture sort of began. And up to that point, for the 200,000 years up to 10,000 years ago, people were hunters and gatherers. And there's a lot of evidence that during that time, they worshipped the Great Mother. It was a female, a feminine society. And only when we got into the whole warrior society did there begin the belief in a male god. And this whole, I've been fascinated by this whole transition. One book I read by Jim Mason is that what happened is 10,000 years ago is when we first started domesticating animals and cultivating the earth. We began to control, the issue of controlling the earth. And it was after that, this whole idea of control, that gradually things shifted. From the Near East 10,000 years ago, agriculture moved gradually to the west, along the Mediterranean and up the Danube Valley, up into Germany. And it took several thousand years for it to really reach Germany. But the evidence is the reason why it kept moving west is because they used up the fertility of the earth behind them. They started tilling the land and using agriculture, but they didn't have the idea of how to compost and how to take care of the earth. And so the deserts were created behind them. But during this time, they started worshiping the male god. And Jim Mason, in his book, he talks about the whole story of Adam and Eve and the creation story. and the Adam and Eve being thrown out of the garden because of their knowledge of good and evil. He sees that as a metaphoric statement of being thrown out of the original Garden of Eden of the hunters and gatherers. That their life was much more peaceful and nurturing and healthy, and it's that paradise that we've been thrown out of. And one little thing that fascinated me, like I said, I just got back from Ireland, and in going through, I was going to mainly the archaeological sites around Ireland, and one person pointed out to me that in Ireland, I guess the end of the Ice Age was about 6,000 years ago, or 6,000 or 7,000 years ago, and the bones that they have found in one of the burial sites that was the oldest, 6,000 years ago, as compared to the bones found in the burial site of 4,000 years ago. The bones in the 6,000 year ago site, the people were living to be about 50 years old, while the more recent one of 4,000 years ago, the bones oldest were found was like 35 years old. So
well, I mean,
again, it really.
Yeah, I mean, I think that agriculture was not really something good. You know, why we changed to agriculture, you know, there's a lot of theories. You know, there was the flood, you know, there was some kind of catastrophe. I mean, there's a lot of theories why we made that transition. But I heard one theory, and I'll share this one with you, or one comment about the whole change of society, which I really like the theory because it makes sense. You know, when somebody says something that actually makes sense, it's like you hang on to it. And their comment was that we became more of a warring people, and yes, tied to agriculture, because I just tilled that soil. I just planted those crops. Those are my crops.
So you need to protect them.
Right. And I was like, you know, that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes sense to me too. I think it's part of the whole image that way. Mm-hmm. But anyway, what I did in this book is, I aimed. I mean, in going into ecstatic trance, I have some control over what I do. I could decide how far back I want to go, for example, or I can, not specific, but if I had an experience yesterday. Today, I could go back to that experience and just sort of develop it even farther. There's that sense of control within this ecstatic trance. And so I basically went back to 3 different periods of time. I went back to like between 4,600 BC and 3,800 BC, back in Scandinavia, when it was really the hunter and gatherer era, when it was worship of the Great Mother. And you look at the mythology of the Nordic people, of Odin and Thor. Those are the warrior gods, but they're always sort of in conflict with the fertility gods of Freya and fire and Nord, which some people really do believe were an ancient, older cult of worship, the cult that occurred during the hunter and gatherers period, but. Really, the stories were not really recorded. So that's what the second half of my book is about. I'll get to that in a couple of minutes. But
yeah, don't you think that's interesting that the whole history of the Veneer is missing, and everything starts out with the Ashir, except for a couple of little stories of their truths, and that's pretty much it. Then they're like this whole mystery race.
It's missing because they didn't have writing. They didn't have a way of recording it.
Well, but that's...
The stories were probably told, but we just don't have a record of them.
Well, unless you're not in control and your whole history just gets wiped out.
Right. Right. Oh, that's happened frequently. Among the Nordic mythology, really, it was very much destroyed by the Catholic monks that came into Scandinavia in the 800s to 1000 AD, and just sort of made fun of the Saxo Grammaticus was a Catholic monk who in Germany tried to record these stories, but is obviously very biased in terms of his Christian beliefs. So as things go on, a lot of information is lost that way. Mm-hmm. But anyway, the one chapter is those stories of when I went back to when they worshipped the Mother Goddess. And then I went back to a period of time of transition, of when the warriors trying to gain land and protect their land started moving north and collided with these earlier ancestors of mine that were worshippers of the Great Mother. Then I go into the third stage of maybe the Viking and pre-Viking stage that was very, very with many, many warriors and very violent and aggressive. So a lot of the book is about those three periods of time, and in each case, I feel like the characters in the story that I'm relating to are my ancestors. And what's interesting too is in the later of those three periods, in each case, my ancestor was more the a safe or the shaman of the community. I think I felt like I had a whole history of shaman way back then. So where are we?
Where are we? Hang on. So, one of the things that you talk about is, we're talking about this whole technique, but we live in a very modern world,
right.
And so how do we integrate or make that become something that is usable, in today's world, or why would we want to use it? I mean, it's just so much easier to go down to 7-Eleven, or if there's something the matter, we go to the hospital, or we go look it up online, or whatever. Why bother doing something like this?
Why bother? When you say that, I have two different directions here. One is because the rational, scientific society that we're living through have gone ahead and been destroying the earth. The whole global warming, and I think there's been a lot of destruction. And I think we could find some, through the magic, we could find some alternatives towards having a healthier earth. And that's what the book I'm just finishing right now, that's exactly what it's about. It's the whole idea of how to become one with our great mother, the earth, through ecstatic trance. What gave me the idea there is Thomas Berry, who is considered one of the fathers of the ecological movement, at one point says there's something really missing in our movement. We're doing these things to try to save the earth, but we're missing the spiritual side of it. And he said that we need to reach out to the great mother, the earth, through dreaming, waking visions, and regaining the shamanic personality. And when I read that in his book, I thought, that's just what ecstatic trance is trying to do. The other side of it, the other dimension to what you just asked, is in these shamanic journeys, it was magical. It was not understood. It just happened. People did what the people would have to go into trance and do what they needed to do to accomplish things, but they didn't really understand what's going on. And Gene Gibson, back in 1948, I think it was, wrote a book that he looks at the 4 eras of consciousness, or the 5 eras. The very first one was the archaic, which we really have very little knowledge about. Then came the magical era, and through archaeology we could see the cave paintings of the magic of trying to, if you draw a picture of a mammoth with a spear in it, that sort of becomes sort of the same thing as doing it in the hunt. It becomes a magical experience. The next era was the mythical era, when people tried to explain things through myth. Then came the rational era, and that's the era that we've been in. He believes that it began around 650 BC and really peaked at the time of Leonardo da Vinci, and now it's on the wane, and now it's coming to an end.
So what era are we in now? The stupid era?
We're in the transitions with the next era, in his mind. We're now going into the era of what he calls time-free transparency, an era where we can now look back and understand the reality of this magic, the reality of the power of the shaman. That when you look at, and he uses modern physics as an example, Irving Laszlo and Rupert Sheldrake both have been doing research in this area. When you look at modern physics, often it just does not make sense rationally. When two things, one thing could be at two different places at once, and if when two nuclei from atoms collide and one disappears, they're realizing that one that disappeared was going backwards in time. And so there's a lot of physics experiments that are suggesting this new way of thinking. And what Rupert Sheldrake comes up with is he was at Cambridge University as a biologist. But he recognized that the atom, the universe is held together by gravitational fields, and the atom is held together by electromagnetic fields. And our whole body is composed of these atoms. So he takes it a step farther. He says that our body is composed of cells. So the cells are composed by these atoms. So our cells have he uses the phrase morphic field. And the cells that come together to make up our liver, we have a liver field, a morphic field for the liver, and one for the heart, and one for our whole body, and one for all human beings together. And he feels that a lot of information of the past really is stored in these fields. And Irving Laszlo takes it a step farther. He recognizes that in the brain there's a skeletal structure that gives the brain its shape, and the skeletal structure is composed of billions of microtubules, which he believes is another sensory mechanism that our body has that hasn't been defined as a sense, but that sense becomes accessible in trance. So there's quite a bit of scientific research and evidence that's developing to demonstrate that this magic is a reality, and it makes sense. And so when I come, I know it's the Cucamonga Institute that was started by Felicitas Goodman. It's in New Mexico, and it's where I was trained to become a certified instructor of ecstatic trance. And they like to talk about these postures as being sacred, that there's something very special and sacred about the posture. What I just told you a few minutes ago about if you look at the posture and ask the question, what is it trying to express? To me, the postures make sense, but somehow I think some of the other instructors would feel that in doing that, I'm taking away some of the sacredness, some of the mystery of the postures. But being the psychologist, having my PhD, and coming from a research background and a rational background, I'm always trying to make sense out of what happens and why these things do work.
But it's also saying that people shouldn't have access to this material because it's somehow secret. Like they talk about the Egyptian mystery schools, and they had the technology to build the pyramids, and then Pythagoras goes and studies in Egypt and learns all of their secret knowledge, and then comes back and has learned the Pythagorean theorem, which he got all the credit for, which, in my humble opinion, he learned from the Egyptians because he just brought it into the public. And so, is it secret? Is it sacred? I mean, the intention, and working with your energy, I think, is definitely sacred. Connecting with yourself and your higher self is definitely sacred. But,
Exactly.
Is the information sacred? No, I think, if the world is going to change, then we all need to learn it in one
Right.
form or another.
And that's what Gibbs are saying. Gibbs are saying that the world is changing, and so we're regaining this. We are now looking at what was considered magical to the early shaman, and have some understanding about why it really worked. Well, I mean, I think. Go ahead.
No, and I totally agree. I mean, if you think about it, there weren't that many people that went under, long periods of training to pass on traditions. I mean, that is something that is a little scary contemporarily, is that we're losing or have lost a lot of these deeper traditions, but at least if we get it out to the public, something will survive versus dying in the hands of a very select few.
One beautiful book is, I really love it, was Vine Deloria. The last book before he died, The World We Used to Live In, is his collection of stories of Native American medicine men and the things that they accomplished, the power of seeing at a distance and seeing into the future. And he just, story after story after story of that he collected of the power of medicine men.
Mm-hmm. So I'm trying to think. I think we have a couple of minutes left because my clock is a little bit off.
Okay.
So what's coming up? You mentioned a little bit earlier you're working on another book. What's with that?
Okay. Actually, the publisher has. Okay. Just real quickly, the second half of this book is about the mythology. The first half of Baldur's Magic is my experiences of going back in time. The second half, I've taken the Nordic myth, and in reading it, many questions came up as to why certain things happened. And I used Trance to go back and find answers to those questions. And so the second half of my book is I refer to it as the Lost Edda of the Vanir. The Asgard was the home of the Nordic gods of Odin, Thor, Balder, and those gods. But then there was the Vanir, which was the home of their pantheon was considered the Vanir, the older gods. And so that whole second half of the book is of the Lost Edda of the Vanir, where I used Trance to go back to these mythical stories and find answers to the questions. My next book, which is I believe is going to be coming out about next March, Bear and Company has accepted it, was Beowulf's Queen Welpero. And I go back to the story of Beowulf, but look at the whole story through the eyes of King Hrothgar's queen, Queen Welpero, who still worships the female goddess, and looks at these men who are always fighting as they don't have to be fighting. And it was really a fun book to write, but again, I used the ecstatic trance to go back and try to find answers to how a woman would deal with all these crazy men who are always having a need to fight. The book I'm finishing up right now is ecstatic ecology, where I use ecstatic trance to look at the in my trance experiences.
Okay, but the clock is running out on us, so we need to kind of wrap up.
Okay.
Yeah, if somebody wants to get a copy of this book, Baldur's Magic, where, like, Amazon.com, all that kind of good stuff?
Amazon has it, and the publisher Bear and Company has it, and Barnes and Noble has it. It's on all, and a lot of the bookstores have it too. So
great. Thank you so much for coming on the show. You're always a wonderful guest, and I look forward to your next book coming out.
Okay, great.
All right.
Thank
you. Have a great night.
I appreciate it. You too. Okay.
All right.
Thank
bye.
you too. Okay. Night.
That was Nicholas Brink. His book is Baldur's Magic, The Power of Norse Shamanism and Ecstatic Trance. His website is www.imaginalmind.net. And we will be back with MJ Ryan after these words from our sponsors.
Just Energy Radio with your host, Dr. Rita Louise, will return right after these messages.